unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Fog Lane School. Great racing car disaster. Sir's new project. We have a lot of laughs in Class 4. I hardly know where to begin. Shall I tell you about the time Mark set fire to Sir's trousers? Or the time Linda lost her knickers? Or, I know. I'll start with the time Don and his mates built a racing car. Nobody will ever forget that in our school, least of all our Sir. He nearly murdered Don that time. It started with the project. Sir came in one Monday morning with 2 big boxes of books, and all these new folders, and rolled-up charts, and coloured card, and God knows what else. Alice and Linda went running up to his car the way they always do, talking posh. "Can we help, Sir? Can we carry anything?" "Oh, thank you, girls, that's very kind of you," said Sir, all smarmy. They always fooled him, every time. Anyway, they went staggering in with all this stuff, and Don and his mates around the corner stuffing themselves with crisps. They had at least 3 bags each, but they notice what's going on all right. They never miss anything, you can be sure of that. "Say that," says Don. "You know what that means? Work, and plenty of it. Sir's been off at the weekend in that posh place they go to, him and Miss Rogers. Don't you remember? He was on about it last week. 'Teachers have to go to school as well,' he says. 'We go on learning all our lives.' He's been planning work for us all weekend." "Him and Miss Rogers," says Darren, grinning. "Aye, aye." "One track mind," says Mark. "Never mind that," says Don. "Give us another crisp. Listen to what I'm telling you. You can bet it'll be a project, and it's naught to laugh about. We'd better be ready for him." They drifted off down the street to the sweet shop, where they treated themselves to a large bar of milk chocolate and a packet of chewy fruits each. They came out with their heads close together. You could tell a mile off that they were up to no good. All this time, Linda and Alice were helping Sir in the classroom. I nipped in, pretending to look for my pencil case to see what was going on. They were putting Sir's charts up all over the walls. They were spreading books out on the tables. They were mixing paints and cutting card. There was a big box marked writing paper and a new set of orange exercise books. As Don said, it looked bad, very bad. Don came back from the sweet shop and tried to slip in, but Sir threw him out smartish. Then he threw me out, and we had to stand in the rain till the bell went. There was the usual mad rush when the bell went, because everybody wanted to get out of the rain. There were lots of oohs and ahs as the others pushed in, goggling at Sir's new displays. Don managed to knock a table of library books over by accident on purpose. Then Mark walked through the middle of the books in his muddy boots. Alice was still mixing powder paint, and Darren pushed her arm so she spilled blue paint all down her new skirt. Then she hit him over the head with a tin of paint, and Sir waded in and stopped them and shouted to everyone to sit down and shut up. The day had started. We got through register and assembly with no more disasters, and then Sir had us sitting on the carpet in the book corner to tell us all about his wonderful new project. Don and Darren and Mark were sitting at the back pulling Nassim's hair, and Nassim was giving them each a jab in the leg with her new pencil. Then they started farting to make everybody laugh, but Sir soon had them at the front with a page of lines each for playtime. That left Jimmy pulling faces in his corner. Jimmy didn't plan to mess things up, he just did it without thinking, and he liked doing lines, so there wasn't much that Sir could do about it. Jimmy sat in a corner where we weren't supposed to see him, but he could look through a crack in the bookcase, and that made us laugh more than ever. In the end, Sir sent Jimmy to stand outside Mrs. Foster's room, so he never really knew what the project was all about. Not that this made much difference to Jimmy, as he wouldn't have done it anyway, but it made a lot of difference to our project, as you'll see later on. We got settled down in the end, and Sir started again about the project. There was a lot about how good work would be expected from everybody. Sir looked hard at Don and Mark and Darren when he said that, and how it would be fun if we got down to it and showed a real interest. We were just going to find out what this project was about when Mrs. Peckham came in with her mop and bucket to complain about the toilets being blocked again with paper towels, and the floors flooded, and Mark had to go out with her to unblock them because he was caught doing it last time it happened. Then Mrs. Foster came in, dragging Jimmy, yelling his head off. She wanted to know what he was doing in the nursery sandpit when he should be in class. When Sir had quietened Jimmy down and explained everything, Mrs. Foster also wanted to know who had peed in the infant's Lego box. Everybody stared at Jimmy, and he went red in the face and started blubbing again, and Mrs. Foster gave him a good telling off and took him out with her. Alice was on her feet with her hand jabbing in the air. Sir, it's not fair. Jimmy might not have done it. He always gets blamed. He always goes red when people look at him. All right, Alice, all right. Just calm down. This was Sir doing his cool act, the laid-back teacher, with his beard and red Adidas running shoes. I've seen his sort before. You have to watch out. They get all matey, all lads and lasses together style. Then they give you 10 times more work than the old-fashioned sort like Miss Edwards. But Alice wouldn't be calmed down, and she finished up in tears as well, and Sir sent her to wash her face. We had lost so many kids now that Sir couldn't go on with talking about the project, so we had our milk. Don and Darren and Mark didn't look very well, and said milk made them sick. Sir smiled his knowing smile at that, but said he'd read us some funny poems till playtime. We had a good laugh at the poems, and we kept on at Sir till he read us the one that goes, "Apple tart makes you fart," and we even got him to read it twice. We all felt better after that. The bell went for playtime, and the sun had come out, so everyone went out except Linda and Nassim. They stayed in to tidy up. The racing car. We had to go in the hall for a road safety talk after playtime, so it wasn't until after dinner that we got back to the project. Sir was looking a bit tired by now, and he wasn't having any nonsense. He even told Alice to sit down and shut up when she started on again about Jimmy. She gave him a look fit to kill, and tossed her hair over her shoulder as she plonked herself down on the carpet. She whispered to Linda, "He can sharpen his own rotten old pencils now," and Sir pretended not to hear. "Now, let's get on with our new project," he said brightly. and we all prepared for the worst. Jimmy still wasn't with us, as his mother had come to take him to get his hair cut. But if we waited for Jimmy, we'd never get anything done. Sir went through all the pep talk again. Luckily, my friend Mumtaz, most kids call him Mummy, gave me a nudge, and I woke up only just in time to find out what it was all about. Well, what it came to in the end was that you could pick your own project and you could work with your mates in a group, or you could work on your own. "It can't have taken them a whole weekend to think that up," said Don. "Yes, Donald. Did you have a comment we could all share?" said Sir pleasantly. "No, sir, it's no," said Don. You could make a model, or a display, or collect some information on the computer. At the word model, Don looked interested, and folded his fat face into an oily smile. He liked making models, especially if he could make a mess at the same time. Then Sir wiped the smile off Don's mug with the next bit. "I'll expect a good piece of writing from everyone to go with the model or display." If there's one thing Don and his pals hated, it was writing. They couldn't spell for toffee, and when Sir looked at their writing books, a look of despair came over his face, and he talked about giving up teaching for good. Now Sir was saying, "I'll give you 5 minutes to choose your subjects and form your groups. Then we'll make a list on the board." I ask you, 5 minutes to decide all that? Just like teachers. I decided to work with Mumtaz. We could do trains again. We'd done it last year, and we still had the stuff at home. We could cut the pictures out and stick them on new bits of card and copy the writing out with all the mistakes left out, because Miss had marked it all last year, and Sir wouldn't know about that. We'd be sure to get a good mark. It was a real old din, with everybody arguing about whose group to be in, never mind what they'd do their project about, and it was more like half an hour before Sir got us all quiet again to make the list on the board. "I bet Don picks stamps again," Mumtaz whispered to me. Don had done stamps every year ever since he was in Class 1. You'd think he'd be sick of them by now, writing the same old stuff out every year. Of course, he'd made a group with Darren and Mark. The three of them had been huddled in the corner for a long time, heads together, like a branch of the mafia planning a murder. They couldn't, I thought, be talking about stamps all that time. When Sir asked them their subject, it came as a surprise. "Racing cars," said Don, with that oily grin again. "That sounds interesting," said Sir, looking hopeful. "What aspect were you thinking of? History? Design? Stories?" "We're going to build one," said Mark with his scornful sneer. "A model," said Darren, picking his nose. "Don't do that, Darren, please," said Sir. "Well, that sounds really good." He wrote, "Racing cars," on the board. "And how will writing come into it?" he asked sweetly. The three nudged each other and giggled, and Darren said, "Well, we'll write a story about racing cars." "I'll expect some discovery work," said Sir. "Right on," said Darren, giving Sir a thumbs-up sign. Said Don and Mark, looking at the floor. When the gang said they'd make a model, we all thought of something that would go on the display table. We were in for a shock. The next day, Don came to school with an enormous lump of wood balanced on his shoulder. Darren brought a pile of empty boxes, and Mark brought 4 wheels that looked suspiciously new, and we all guessed that he'd nicked them off somebody's pram. Sir had put a box in the classroom marked "Project Materials." They dumped all this stuff on top of the box, squashing it flat. When Sir told Don to move his wood, there was a sound of smashing glass that made us all jump. He'd put the end through a window. Then we had Mrs. Foster in, and Mrs. Peckham with her brushes, and the council blokes came to put a new window in, and Don nicked all their putty. They thought they'd come without it, and went all the way back to the depot for more. Don sold the putty later to the infants at 10p a lump, and they threw it at people's windows on the way home. Little Sammy from reception tried to eat his. Poor kid, his mum never gave him any breakfast, and he couldn't have school dinner since the strike. Anyway, it made him sick, and he was rushed off to hospital in case he'd swallowed any. He was there for 3 days. When he came back, he said he'd had smashing grub, and he didn't want to come home. He asked Don if he had any more putty, but he'd sold it all by then. That was just the start of that racing car. If Sir had only known what was coming. I heard him telling Don and friends not to worry about the broken window, but to get on regardless with their project. That was his big mistake. It was like telling King Kong to go out and have fun. Sir even allowed them to stay in at dinner time to work on the racing car, something they'd never been trusted to do before. I think Sir was living in a world of his own by then, letting that lot loose on their own in the classroom. I know what it was. You could tell by the way he talked to them, and stood and admired their work. After all these years of being the worst kids in the school, he thought, he had at last found something that really turned them on. They would work hard at their project, and Sir would proudly show their model off on Parents' Evening at the end of term. Don't tell anybody, please, but I did try to warn Sir. I knew disaster was on the way. It just wasn't like Don and his mates to please teachers. I knew they must be up to something. I got Sir on his own after school one day and asked if I could make a suggestion. "Look, Sir," I said, "couldn't we just drop all this project nonsense and get back to doing our news book and a board of sums?" "Good heavens, no," he laughed. "The class has never worked so well before. Look, even our friends Donald and Darren and Mark are working for once in their lives." "That's what I mean, Sir," I said. But he didn't understand. It was no use. He'd just have to find out for himself. The whirlpool. Don and his mates took over a whole corner of the classroom for their racing car. They also took over most of the things that Sir had set out for us all to use for our projects. If you wanted glue, or scissors, or card, or paint, you had to go and rummage for it amongst the pile of wood and boxes in the racing car corner, as it came to be known. This led to fights, until the rest of us built up a stockpile of equipment in Sir's cupboard and got Sir to keep it locked whenever he was out of the room. Don loved making a lot of noise, so he really enjoyed a bit of heavy hammering when the rest of us were trying to write about our projects. I went off to the school library with Mumtaz whenever I could, but you could still hear it from there. One day, Darren brought a big steel box to school with thick wires and cables coming out of it. He had it plugged in and started up before Sir had even seen it, and there was a shower of sparks like a firework display and a brilliant blue light. Sir came just in time to see the school fuse box blow up. Every single fuse had blown, and we had no lights or heating till dinner time. "What in heaven's name were you doing?" shouted Sir. "It's my dad's welder," said Darren. "My God, boy, do you want to burn the school down?" Sir was shouting so much that he was losing his voice altogether. "Wouldn't mind, Sir," said Darren, grinning. "I was only doing my project, Sir," he added, looking offended at Sir's fury. "We want this racing car to be really good." "Well, I appreciate your enthusiasm," said Sir, "but you are not the only people in this school, and you will have to learn to work without wrecking everything else. You could have killed someone with that thing. Does your father know you've borrowed it?" "No, Sir, but he lets me use it at home." "Well, you're not using it here. Understood?" "Yes, Sir." You know how Darren says, "Yes, Sir." You can tell it means, "Get lost, Sir," and that he's already planning his next move. Well, that's how he said it, and the rest of us decided to keep as far away from that racing car as we could whilst they were building it. Mind you, we had to admit that it was looking quite impressive. It seemed almost as big as a real racer, with a proper steering wheel and gear lever from Darren's dad's scrapyard, and you could get in it and imagine you were roaring round the track at Le Mans. Have you ever seen a picture of a whirlpool? You know how it sucks everything in and swallows it up? Well, that's how it was with Don's racing car. It was a classroom whirlpool. They started with the wood and boxes they'd brought in, and most of Sir's supply of card and glue for the year had already gone into it, but that was only the start. That car had to have every fitting you could dream of. The most unlikely things began to be sucked into it. One day, when we were doing science, Sir searched through every cupboard looking for his glass funnel. If he'd taken a close look at the car's horn, he would have known where his funnel was. But it did look different, covered with foil from the kitchen. Sir never did dare tell the cook where the rest of her foil had gone. There were dozens of shiny fittings on that car. The suction was getting too powerful for just our classroom now, and it began to take in the rest of the school. A small carpet disappeared from the top infant's classroom, and Miss Edwards kept all the infants in the hall for 3 playtimes, trying to get them to tell where it had gone. In the end, little Susie Mathers came up to Miss Edwards and did one of her wet whispers in her ear. "It's in a motor car." "In a motor car?" said Miss Edwards. "Don't be silly, child. How can it be in a motor car? Whose motor car?" But Susie clammed up and wouldn't say another word, and got kept in at playtime for making things up, and no one ever guessed that Susie was telling the truth. Some cushions followed the carpet. You have to have comfortable seats in a car. By now it seemed to be a mixture of cars, and its racing car beginnings were being lost sight of. It was a cross between a grand tourer and a jalopy. It gained a radio and a cassette player that looked very much like one that went missing from Rose Sutcliffe's bag in the cloakroom, but it was in a black box instead of a red one, and she couldn't prove that it was hers. There was a hidden supply of drinks behind a flap in one of the boxes. Playtime cans of Coca-Cola went missing every day, but Sir never rumbled what was going on until the end. It had 2 compasses, a thermometer, and a life jacket. This life jacket was really a swimming float belonging to someone in Class 2. What was a life jacket doing in a racing car, you may ask? You'll only get a thump if you ask Don, but the car was taking on many of the features of a boat now. You see, Sir was nagging on about them doing some writing, and Mark had found an old project his brother had done on boats, and they thought they could copy that out. Then Darren got on about spaceships. You never knew what to expect from one day to another, and Sir had given up trying. Blue powder paint. Then came the day of the great painting. Don had decided to paint the model in deep blue paint. With a good covering of blue, many of the parts of the car that people might get suspicious about when it went on display at Parents' Evening would be so well disguised that no one would know them. Don's mates were playing football at lunchtime, so he decided to do it himself. He never knew I'd watched him through the window. He found 2 large tins of blue powder paint in a cupboard. Then he went to Mrs. Peckham, our caretaker, and asked to borrow a bucket for Sir. He tipped all the powder in the bucket, then he put it under the tap. Being Don, he liked things to happen quickly, so he turned both taps full on. The water comes out like a jet plane in our school. You have to watch it even when you're washing your hands. But mixing powder paint is something else. Have you ever done it? At first, the water seems as though it doesn't want to mix with the powder. Somehow, the powder seems too dry for it, and the water sort of bounces off it. You have to put a small amount in and give it a really good stirring with a spoon. Don had 2 new tins full of the stuff, and 2 high-pressure jets of water. The powder shot out of the bucket like a fountain and into Don's face. It covered him. It hung in big drops on his eyebrows and lashes. It dripped down his fat cheeks and off the end of his nose. I have never seen anything so funny in all my life as this sight of a bright, blue Don. I had to stuff my hanky in my mouth and roll on the grass so that he wouldn't hear me laughing, and a dinner lady came by and thought I was having some kind of a fit. She sent me to the toilets to splash cold water over my face and calm me down. It worked all right, and a good thing too, as Don came running in and looked in horror at himself in the mirror. That set me off again, and he hit me and made me help to clean him up. The next thing was that Don made me help him to paint the car. He wasn't put off at all by the accident. He couldn't get in much worse of a mess, as I pointed out, and got another thump for my trouble. I put an apron on and helped Don. I like painting anyway, so I didn't mind helping, and I was longing to get a close look at the car, or boat, or spaceship, or whatever it was by now. I think it had gone back to being a car, at least in Don's tiny mind. A bright blue car. I mixed the bucket of blue paint properly, and we set to work. We were slopping the paint over on the floor quite a bit, and I had an idea. "Say, Don," I said, "why don't we stand the paint in that old water tray? Then if we do spill it, it won't do any harm." "Good idea," grunted Don. "Go on then, do it." I dragged the empty water tray across to where we were working. Now all the splashes and drips went in the plastic tray, which would be easy to wash. We had painted the car all over, but Don wanted to add paste to the paint and put a second coat on to make sure of covering all its secrets. He said the paste would add a gloss to the car and make it waterproof. So he emptied 2 or 3 packets of paste powder into the bucket, added more water, and we gave the mess a good stirring. He was always in a hurry to do things, and it was this that brought on disaster. He pushed past me to get at the bucket of paint and knocked the lot over. I wasn't too worried, as the water tray should have caught the mess. It did, so we went on painting, dipping our brushes into the water tray instead of the bucket. We seemed to be using the paint up very quickly. One moment there was plenty of it. The next it was almost all gone. I was just wondering about this when I heard a sound. "Don," I said, "what's that dripping?" We stopped and listened. Just then the whistle went outside, and the noise in the playground stopped. Everything went quiet, except for this drip, drip, drip. Then a whole lot of things dawned on me at once. I was standing in something wet and sticky. There was a tide of this wet and sticky stuff moving across the classroom floor. The dripping was coming from the water tray. All water trays have a plug hole like a bath for emptying them. The plug belonging to this water tray was now the radiator cap on Don's racing car. The stuff on the floor was our missing blue paint, and there was no way of stopping it. "Quick," I said, "we'll have to get a mop." But it was too late. The whistle had gone again. They were all coming in for afternoon school. You could hear the running of hundreds of feet along the corridors. Like the paint, there was no way we could stop them. I ran to the classroom door, leaving a blue trail. Again I was too late. The door was pushed open, and in they came. Where was Sir? This was one moment when we needed him, and he wasn't there. Only Sir could have made them wait. Before they knew it, they were paddling in our paint and glue mixture, spreading it everywhere. In the panic, books were knocked on the floor, and 2 desks went over, spilling everything in them in the paint. The kids at the front tried to push back through the door, but the ones outside were still pushing to get in. Jimmy slipped and fell in the paint, pulling 2 others down with him. You never saw such a mess. There were shouting, fighting, screaming and crying kids everywhere, most of them spattered with blue paint. It looked like a battle in one of these old SF films with all the colours gone wrong. Then some of the kids from Class 3 came in to see what was up and made things still worse. Little Jenny came with the register, and it got knocked out of her hand into the paint, and she ran off down the corridor crying. In the middle of all this, I was amazed to see that Don was still painting the car, and defending it from any harm. I don't know how long it all went on. It would have to be the day that Sylvia Thompson's cat was stuck up a tree in the school garden, and our sir had gone to get a ladder to get it down. That was why he was so late in getting back to the classroom after the whistle had gone. He turned up in the end with the cat in his arms, purring like mad. The cat, not Sir. Sir nearly fainted, and he was soon roaring. He let out such a shout that the cat dug its claws into his arm, jumped down and shot out into the garden and up to the top of the highest tree it could find. It took hours and hours to sort everything out. We didn't do any work at all the rest of that day. No, that was nothing to cheer about, though some silly kids did. Mrs. Foster kept us in for 10 playtimes and gave us masses of homework to make up. We all had to take our clothes off and put our PE things on. Then we cleaned up our clothes and the room as well as we could. Mrs. Peckham brought buckets of hot water and detergent, and we mopped and swilled and swept for hours. There were skirts and jumpers and trousers, all patched and spotted in blue of various shades, on the radiators down every corridor of the school. The last thing to be sorted out was Sylvia's cat. Sir had to go and borrow a longer ladder, and then the cat wouldn't come down for him. Mrs. Foster had to climb up for it, and it was past 7 o'clock before they got it down. Not that many of our class were there to see it, as most of us were sent to bed early for coming home with our clothes covered in blue paint. The history of motor cars. After that terrible day, any kid from another class who asked laughingly if we were feeling blue would automatically get a good thumping. And it was a miracle that the racing car lived to see another day. Sir threatened to smash it to smithereens, but Don, for the first time ever, looked as though he would burst into tears, and begged Sir, with moist eyes, to allow the car to be kept, if only for parents' evening. This softened Sir's heart, and besides, he knew that the car was all that Don's group had to show for half a term's work. Sir would look silly, too, if there were nothing to show the parents. "And where is your written work?" said Sir to Don, Mark and Darren, gathered in a little huddle in front of his desk. Sir was being clever for once. He had struck them at their weakest moment. There was a long silence, whilst all three shuffled from foot to foot. Then Don seemed to waken up, smiled as though he had just now discovered the answer to Sir's question, and said, "Lost it, Sir." "Lost it? Lost your writing? How could you? All three of you, all at once?" "Yes, Sir." "Explain," said Sir, and wished at once that he hadn't, because Don set out on one of his famous explanations. No one had ever followed him to the end of one of these stories without getting lost and hopelessly mixed up. This was why he told them. He was a whiz at doing it. He soon lost Sir, and Sir asked him to start again. He was quite glad to do this, but the stories seemed quite different this time, though every bit as good. Sir asked a question that he thought would catch Don out, but it only made the story all the more complicated. Sir should have known better by now. It ended with Sir banging his desk loudly and shouting, "That's enough of your lies. I want to see all three of you with at least 5 pages of writing by Friday. If you don't do it, I'll send for your parents at once. Never mind waiting for parents' evening. Go on now, get on with it." A look of pain crossed Don's face. "But, Sir—" "No more arguing. Back to your places and get on with it." The week went on more quietly now. A few grubby and crumpled pieces of paper were seen on the desks of Don, Darren and Mark. 2 had drawings of spaceships on them. 1 had the words, "The History of Motor Cars," written on it, but nothing more. They went on adding bits to their car and titivating it with pieces of foil brought from home. They spent a lot of time pretending to drive it, or fly it, or sail it, depending on how they felt. Friday came, and still no piece of writing had been done. Sir threw a temper and sent them to Mrs. Foster. She sent them back with a toffee each. She must have thought they'd been sent to report good work. They'd eaten the toffees by the time they came back, so there wasn't much Sir could do about that, except tell them off again. He said they had to work over the weekend, sent a note for each of their parents asking them to see that they did the work, and threatened hellfire and blue murder if they didn't do it. We were all waiting for the Don gang to get into real trouble on Monday. Nobody expected them to bring their work in. Don would be helping in his dad's shop all weekend. Darren would be looking after his little brothers and sisters, whilst his mum and dad went to the boozer. Mark would be off round the shops in town with a gang his big brother was in. You can imagine the surprise when they all came walking in on Monday with new folders in their hands, with a piece of work inside each one, and handed them in to Sir. He gave them a big smile, thanked them, and told them to sit down. Sir looked pleased with himself all through register and assembly, and he was specially nice to Don. He even let him off when he made rude noises during the hymn. Back in the classroom, Sir opened the folders. His smile disappeared. "What is this?" he said, spacing his words out. "Our project, sir," said Don. "I thought your project was on racing cars," said Sir, dangerously. "It was," said Don, "but we changed." "This is on stamps," said Sir. "That's right," said the other two. "What is that over there?" said Sir, pointing to the car. "It looks like a car to me. It isn't a model of a postage stamp, is it?" A bright thought struck Don, and his face lit up. "Sir, sir," he said, "look, there's a racing car on that stamp there." "Yes," said Sir. "So what?" "It's, the one in our model." "No," said Darren. "Our model isn't a racing car at all. It's a high-speed post office van. In Australia." "'Tisn't," said Mark. "It's a spaceship." "Oh, heavens," cried Sir, losing his cool. "Not again. But whatever it is, where is your writing? These are just pages of stamps. There's no writing at all." "We'll bring it tomorrow," said Don. They did bring some writing the next day, and it wasn't on stamps or racing cars. It was on boxing. That was what Mark's big brother had done his project on last term at the high school, and he let them copy it. But Sir couldn't prove it, could he? Divided we fall. Parents' evening was quite near now, and the class began to get their work ready for display. Great care was taken of the racing car. Then Don had another idea. "Could we take our car to show the infants?" he asked. Sir was touched. Here were these tough boys who were always fighting and making trouble, and now they wanted to give pleasure to the little children with the model they had worked so long on. They were human after all. How could Sir refuse? "All right then, but do take good care of it. We must have something to show that you've done some work this term." Off they went, carrying their car between them. It left a large paint-spattered gap in the classroom. The room seemed bigger and quieter. We all settled down to the work of finishing our projects. It was so quiet that you could hear the clock ticking, the snip-snap of scissors, and the scraping sound of pencils being sharpened. "Any quiet, Sir?" said Linda, in her sucking-up-to-Sir voice. Sir looked happy for once. He smiled fondly at Linda. "Yes, love," he said, "so let's not spoil it, and get some good work done." Get that, love? Sir must be in a really good mood. There was a chance of getting a long playtime out of him, if all went well. We bent over our desks and scribbled away as though we meant it. But it was too good to last. There was a sound of distant shouting down the corridor, and it was coming nearer. We lifted our heads to listen. "Get on with your work," said Sir, but nobody took any notice. There were thumps and bangs mixed in with the shouting, then running boots. The door burst open, and Don fell into the room, carrying the front half of the racing car. He was crying and shouting at the same time, and Sir could make no sense of him. His nose was bleeding, and the blood and tears got mixed up and smeared all over his face and down his jumper. Sir sent Linda to get some wet paper towels from the cloakroom to clean him up, and when she came back she said, "Oh, Sir, there's a right mess in the infants' corridor," and Sir rushed out to see, and we crowded round Don to get a close look at the blood. All this excitement did something to Jimmy. He took out his new packet of coloured pencils and began throwing them round the classroom. One hit Mumtaz in the face, and there was another fight going on by the time Sir came back with Darren and Mark, dragging the other half of the racing car behind them. When they saw Don, they started laughing, and he went for them, and we cheered him on. It took Sir ages to stop all the fights and get everyone sitting down again. It's a wonder the car wasn't smashed to bits, but there it still was, though in two halves now. When Don had wiped his face clean and calmed down, Sir said, "Now, Donald, what was that all about, and who has broken your car? Since you've put a stop to the work of the whole class, you'd better explain yourself." "It was them," said Don, still snivelling. Darren and Mark jumped up with their fists ready. "Now sit down," shouted Sir. "You can't solve problems by fighting. Let's just calm down and find out what happened. Never mind whose fault it was. What happened when you went out of that door?" Don set out again on his story. Sir saw his mistake at once. I've told him thousands of times, never ask Don to explain anything. Nobody had the foggiest what Don was on about. Sir asked Darren, but he wouldn't talk at all. He just screwed his face up and stared at Sir. Mark was no better. In the end, Sir just said they'd have to mend the car at dinner time, and everyone could sit down quietly now and write their projects. We were all getting tired of the fuss, so we did sit down at our tables. Our hands went up all over the room with shouts of, "Sir, my pencil's gone!" And Sir said, "But you can't all have lost your pencils all at once." We had, though, every one of us, except Jimmy. He had one pencil left that he hadn't thrown away. "I left mine on my desk, I know I did, it's not fair," said Linda. Mumtaz told Sir about Jimmy throwing his coloured pencils round the room, and we scrabbled on the floor to find them, and Sir said we could use them to write our projects, but the points kept breaking, and there was a queue at the pencil sharpener till the bell went for playtime, so nobody got any work done at all. Our Timmy's a middle infant, and when I saw him in the yard, he told me all about what had happened when they brought the car down to the infants. There was an argument between Don and Darren and Mark about which class to take the car to. Don wanted his little sister to play with it in Timmy's class, but Darren and Mark had brothers in the top infants and wanted to take it there. They were stuck halfway through the door, arguing about which way to go. Then a tug-of-war started, with Don trying to pull the car into the room and Darren and Mark trying to pull it out. Miss Edwards came along, and then there was a snapping sound, and the car came apart. Something fell out onto the floor with a sound of breaking plastic, and Rosie Sutcliffe said it was her missing cassette player and started to cry. 2 cans of lager rolled out next from the hidden drinks box. Don tripped over the cans and lurched out into the corridor and went for Darren and Mark. Miss Edwards got a good thump trying to stop them and went off to fetch Mrs. Foster. The fight moved down the corridor, and our Sir came out and stopped it when it got near enough, and the rest I knew. I left Timmy to his skipping and went to see what was going on in the junior playground. You'd think there'd have been a big fight between Don and Mark about Darren. Not a bit of it. The 3 of them were good friends again, and they were passing sweets and crisps round in the bushes at the end of the school garden, planning their next move. Sir had a new box of pencils when we went back in the classroom, so we had to do our work now. He didn't find out where all the pencils had been going till this lot disappeared as well on the Thursday afternoon, when we had the road safety film, and Sir made us all empty our trays and spread them out on the tables. There were 65 pencils in Jimmy's tray. "Where did you get these pencils, Jimmy?" said Sir, with murder in his voice. Jimmy began to cry, but managed to blubber out, "Me mum got them from the shop," before Linda shouted, "That's mine! It's got my name on it, look!" And we all crowded round, grabbing at our pencils. Of course, Sir had to send for Mrs. Foster, and she took Jimmy off to her room. He stayed in for a whole week of playtimes, and his mother came in to complain before he'd tell how he got the pencils. He'd been sneaking in at playtime and going through all our trays and getting our pencils. Mrs. Foster made him come and say he was sorry to the whole class. He wasn't sorry at all, you could tell that. He was laughing while he said it. Then Mrs. Foster said, "But why did you do it, Jimmy? You have plenty of pencils of your own." Jimmy just hung his head and giggled. He didn't know why he did it. It was just the sort of thing that Jimmy does, and it's no use asking him why. He doesn't know himself. In the end, Mrs. Foster went away, and we got on with our work. Don and his mates mended the car at dinner time, and it looked just as good as before. "At least we'll have something for parents' evening," said Sir. You know, it amazes me. Teachers are always on about learning, and yet they never seem to learn. Disaster. "Bags I take the car home after parents' night," said Don. "Bags you don't," said Darren. "It's no good fighting about it again," said Mark. "It'll only get bust. Let's ask Sir to decide." "Well done," said Sir. He'd been listening into all this. "I do think you're beginning to learn to do things with words instead of fists." "Well, who can take it then?" said Don. "Let's toss up for it," said Sir in his cheerful voice. First mistake. I saw it coming. "It's not fair," said Don. "That car was my idea." Sir took no notice. Second mistake. He tossed the coin, Darren called and won. He tossed again, Darren against Mark, and Darren won again. "It's a fiddle," muttered Don. Still Sir took no notice, and Don went mumbling and muttering back to his seat and looking murder at Sir. Everything would have been all right, until parents' evening at least, if Mrs. Foster hadn't had one of her bright ideas. The car was rebuilt, and most of the projects were about finished, when Sylvia Thompson came round on Monday morning with a note on a piece of paper. Sir said, "All stop what you are doing and listen carefully. Here's a message from Mrs. Foster. She says, 'I have seen such excellent work being done around the school that I would like us all to share it before parents' evening on Wednesday. When your teacher tells you, please bring your work carefully to the hall, and we will have a wonderful display for Tuesday's assembly. There will be 10 minutes for each class to tell us about their work.'" Did you all hear that? Jimmy made Dalek noises and wandered round the classroom exterminating people. Sir took no notice. He was too worried by the message. He could spot trouble a mile off. "We'd better have some good work to put in the hall, so get on with it," said Sir. Miraculously, for once, we all did. There was a knock at the door. It was Sylvia again. "Mrs. Foster says, could Donald and his group please bring their model car to the hall now?" "Now watch it, you lot," Sir growled. "We don't want any more trouble with that car." They edged the car out of the door, and you could hear the class giving a little oh of relief at seeing them go. They had to cross the school garden to get to the hall, and you could hear their voices fading into the distance, still talking about who should take the car home after parents' evening. Jimmy was quietly sharpening his pencils, and he went on with this until they were all sharpened into stubs too short to use. But it kept him quiet, so Sir didn't interfere. The rest of us were writing away, and it was one of the peaceful times you remember for a long time. You could hear the traffic on the flyover, and somebody walking along by the shops with a ghetto blaster playing an old Beatles song. It was great. real smooth. Then there was another sound added. You couldn't say when you first noticed it, or who first heard it, but suddenly everybody stopped what they were doing to strain their ears to listen. It was far away, and it echoed round the school like the sound effects in a spooky horror film. Whatever was it? Sir looked up to listen, then said, "Get on with your work. It's nothing to do with us." The sounds came a bit nearer, and a bit clearer. There was mixed-up shouting and banging. Had somebody broken into Mrs. Goulam's room to nick the dinner money? Had somebody kidnapped Mrs. Foster? No such luck. The sounds came still nearer. Sir got up to look out of the window. We all followed him. It was a battle. There were 3 muddy boys in the school garden, shouting and fighting. It had come on to rain, and they had landed up in the middle of a very wet flower bed. They were rolling over and over in the mud, and one of them had just got his mouth full of it. They were so muddy that we didn't know at first who they were. Then we saw some broken blue boxes and some pram wheels scattered round. Mumtaz yelled, "It's Don and his mates! Look, somebody's wrecked their car!" "All sit down and get on with your work at once," Sir shouted, then ran out to stop the fight. Of course, we all went straight back to the windows. We couldn't miss the fun, could we? It took ages for Sir to sort them out and stop the fight. Darren was crying and shouting at Sir, and Mark's nose was bleeding. Don's jeans were torn all down the leg, but he just sat in the mud looking fed up. Sir went off and brought Mrs. Foster and Mrs. Goulam, and they took the 3 of them off towards the nursery. Nobody could guess why they went there, until Linda piped up. She helps with the little ones at dinner time, and she knows a lot about the nursery. "I know," she said. "There's a shower in the nursery. I bet they're going to put them in the shower." Nassim spotted Sir coming back, and we all ran to our desks and pretended to be working. He must have known we weren't really, but he didn't bother. He just sat down and went on with his marking. Later on, Sir sent me and Mumtaz and Linda to collect the bits of the racing car from the garden. There wasn't much left of it. We piled the bits in the car's place in the classroom. Sir was surprised to see quite a lot of things amongst the car's bits that had been missing from the classroom for a long time, but most of them were broken by now. We didn't see Don and Darren and Mark for the rest of that morning. A kid from Class 3 came for their PE things just before playtime, but they were kept in. Then we saw them getting their dinners. They looked red and clean, and their hair was spiky with the water. They were wearing old coats from the lost property box. They had to sit at a table with Mrs. Foster for their dinner, and she took them off to her room when they had finished. She sent Linda to get their maths and writing books, and that was that for the rest of the afternoon. We had a really quiet time in the classroom, and Sir was so pleased with us that he read us an extra chapter of Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. Just before home time, Imran was on the way to the toilets when he spotted them getting into Mrs. Foster's car. They were in real trouble this time. Mrs. Foster would take them home and have a barney with their parents. I called for Mark after tea, but his mum said he wasn't coming out and banged the door hard. That was the end of the model racing car, thank goodness. Don and his mates weren't allowed to play out for a week after that, and they had to stay in and do lines every single playtime and dinner time. You couldn't get a word out of them about that last fight, or the car, or what happened when they went to the nursery. They were never the same again. On Parents' Evening, Don and his mates put their boxing topic in the display, but their parents didn't come anyway.